years old now, but it's a book that I really thoroughly appreciated. A Wind in the House of Islam, How God is Drawing Muslims Around the World to Faith in Jesus Christ. And I wanted to talk a bit about this, if that's okay. First of all, what is the House of Islam and why is that important?
Well, the House of Islam is a term that was coined by Muslim historians and jurists, as they call them, all the way back in the early days of Islam. And it referred to dividing the world into two houses. One was called Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, which is the house of peace, where Islam is dominant. The other was called, where Islam was not yet dominant, was called the Dar al-Harb, which in Arabic means the house of war. And this was the place that Islam was going into and advancing into. It's interesting as we looked at where God is bringing hundreds of thousands of Muslims to faith in Jesus Christ. The vast majority, well over 90% of these, are taking place inside the House of Islam, inside the Muslim-dominated world. And yet, even within that House of Islam, it's not a monolith. You know, if you go from West African Muslim countries like Senegal and Mali, sweep across North Africa, Algeria, Libya, so forth, into the Middle East, Egypt, across Saudi Arabia, and then into Central Asia, where you've got the Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, down into Southwest Asia with Iran, and across into Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and then finally the far eastern nations of Malaysia and Indonesia. Indonesian Muslims are quite different than West African Muslims, from one end of the Muslim world to the other. That's the House of Islam. So within that house, we identified 9 geocultural rooms. These are geographical areas that have sort of evolved and developed together over the last 1,000 years. West Africa, for example, is rather distinct from North Africa. So those are 2 different rooms in the House of Islam. Likewise, the Arab room is very much a different room from the Persian room or the Iranian room, which is also different from the Turkestani room, which extends from Turkey in the west to the Uyghur people of Western China in the east. So each of these 9 rooms has its own sort of cultural flavor, its own foods, its own history, its own language families. What we wanted to see was, where are these Muslim movements to Christ, these hundreds of thousands of Muslims that we're hearing about? Where is it happening? Is it in 1 or 2 rooms? Or could it possibly be in all 9 rooms in the House of Islam? And my book gathered over 1,000 interviews and traveled over 250,000 miles throughout the House of Islam into all 9 rooms, and found that there are Muslim movements to Christ, in some cases a few thousand, in some cases tens and even hundreds of thousands of Muslims who are coming to faith in Christ in these movements that are spreading, that have been spreading really just in the last 25 to 30 years. God is doing something in our day we've never seen before. We are in fact witnessing the greatest turning of Muslims to Christ in history.